On the night of October 13th, 1207, the harbor of La Rochelle fell into an unnatural silence. 18 Templar galleys, their hulls heavy with cargo that would never appear in any inventory, slipped through the black waters of the Atlantic. No bells rang, no torches lit their departure. The most powerful military order in Christendom was vanishing into darkness, and the only witnesses were paid to forget what they had seen. By dawn, the harbor was empty. By noon, the King of France had issued arrest warrants for every Templar in his kingdom. But the ships, and whatever sacred burden they carried, had already dissolved into legend. For 7 centuries, historians have searched for those vessels. They have combed archives, decoded manuscripts, and followed fragmentary clues across 3 continents. Some found evidence too compelling to ignore. Others found only silence. The kind of silence that ends careers and closes archives. The official narrative insists the Templars were guilty of heresy, that their wealth was confiscated, that their order died in the flames of persecution. But official narratives have a peculiar way of omitting the most important details, like why the Vatican has never released the complete trial documents, like why entire libraries of Templar records simply ceased to exist after 1307, like why, centuries later, symbols of the Knights Templar began appearing in places they should never have reached. What if everything you were taught about the fall of the Templars was designed to hide a truth so explosive that it required the collaboration of kings, popes, and inquisitors? What if those 18 ships did not flee into oblivion, but sailed toward a destination already known to their navigators? The Templars were more than warrior monks. They were bankers, diplomats, and keepers of knowledge that predated Christianity itself. They had excavated beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem for 9 years. They had established a network that spanned from Scotland to the Holy Land. And when the blow finally came, they were ready. The cargo loaded onto those galleys in the dead of night was not merely gold or relics. Witnesses who survived the initial arrests, before they too disappeared, spoke of crates sealed with lead, of parchments wrapped in silk, of something precious enough to justify the sacrifice of an entire order. Kings who confiscated Templar properties found treasuries strangely depleted. The legendary wealth that Philip the Fair coveted had evaporated. Either the Templars had been far poorer than believed, or someone had moved their most valuable assets beyond his reach. The Church preferred the world believed the former. The evidence suggests the latter. Tonight, the fragments converge. Archaeological discoveries buried in academic journals, maritime records that contradict official timelines, genetic evidence from communities that should not exist. The pattern is undeniable for those willing to see it. 18 ships carried something into the Atlantic darkness, something important enough that 7 centuries of institutional power have been deployed to ensure it remains hidden. The question is no longer whether the Templar fleet survived their voyage. The question is what they were protecting, where they took it, and why the same forces that destroyed them still fear the answer. You have been taught that the Knights Templar fell because of heresy and greed. You learned in school that on Friday, October 13th, 1207, King Philip IV of France arrested them all simultaneously, ending 2 centuries of Christian military dominance in the Holy Land. The textbooks tell you their wealth was confiscated, their leaders burned at the stake, their order dissolved by papal decree. This narrative has been repeated so many times that it has become indistinguishable from fact. But there is a problem with this story, a problem so enormous that entire academic departments have been built to ignore it. On the night of October 12th, 1207, roughly 24 hours before the arrests began, 18 fully loaded Templar galleys departed from the port of La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast. These were not small vessels. Each galley could carry between 80 and 120 men, plus cargo. That means somewhere between 1,400 and 2,100 Templars vanished into the Atlantic darkness, along with whatever they were transporting. The harbor records from La Rochelle for that specific night have never been found. The portmaster's logs, which should have documented every departure, simply do not exist for October 12th. This is not an accident. This is not a gap in the historical record. This is deliberate erasure. Consider the mathematics of what disappeared that night. 18 galleys. Multiply that by an average crew of 100 men. That is 1,800 trained warriors, navigators, and scribes who simply vanished from history. Now consider their cargo. Templar galleys were designed for both war and transport. Their holds could carry tons of material. Contemporary accounts from other ports describe Templar ships loaded with crates sealed in lead, wooden chests bound with iron, and bundles wrapped in oiled cloth. Witnesses who later testified under torture, before they died, mentioned seeing symbols on these containers that they could not read, languages they did not recognize. By the time royal investigators reached La Rochelle, the warehouses were empty. The ships were gone, and anyone who might have seen what was loaded onto them had either fled or could no longer remember. The official church position, established at the Council of Vienne in 1312, states that the Templar order was suppressed due to allegations of heresy, idol worship, and immoral practices. Pope Clement V issued the papal bull Vox in Excelso, officially dissolving the order. Philip IV confiscated their properties throughout France. Other European monarchs followed suit, seizing Templar assets in England, Aragon, Portugal, and Italy. The narrative is clean, logical, and entirely focused on what happened on land. It never mentions the sea. It never mentions La Rochelle. It never mentions 18 ships that were confirmed to exist in port inventories from September, but had vanished by November. This omission is not careless. It is surgical. Now here is where the impossible proportions begin to reveal themselves. The Templar order, at its height, controlled an estimated 9,000 properties across Europe and the Levant. They operated a banking network that financed kingdoms. They possessed detailed maps of trade routes from Scotland to Jerusalem. Their archives contained correspondence with Muslim scholars, Jewish mystics, and Eastern Christian sects. After the arrests, Philip IV expected to find rooms full of gold, vaults overflowing with the legendary Templar treasure. Instead, he found properties whose treasuries had been systematically emptied. The wealth that should have existed, the accumulated fortune of 200 years of donations, tithes, and successful military campaigns, had evaporated. Either the Templars were far poorer than anyone believed, or someone had moved the assets beyond royal reach. The king chose to believe the former because acknowledging the latter would mean admitting that the Templars had advance warning, had time to prepare, and had successfully spirited away the most valuable elements of their order. But you see, there is evidence they knew. In September of 1207, exactly 1 month before the arrests, Templar commanders across France began selling properties at prices far below market value. They converted real estate into portable wealth: gold, silver, gemstones, and trade documents. This was documented. Notaries recorded these transactions. The pattern is undeniable. Then, in early October, several Templar preceptories in coastal regions reported sudden departures of senior members for unspecified missions. The Order of the Temple was a military organization with strict hierarchies and documentation requirements. These departures should have been logged, approved, and archived. The documents do not exist. The commanders who left were never seen again. And precisely 11 days later, King Philip struck. The man who planned the Templar evacuation was Gérard de Villiers, the master of France and commander of the La Rochelle preceptory. Historical records describe him as a brilliant administrator and skilled diplomat. He had served in the Holy Land, survived the fall of Acre in 1291, and had been personally appointed by Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, to oversee Templar operations in France. De Villiers understood politics, strategy, and most importantly, timing. When Philip IV began consolidating power and expressing interest in Templar wealth, de Villiers did not ignore the signs. He prepared, he organized, and when the moment came, he executed an evacuation so precise that historians have spent 7 centuries trying to reconstruct it. What is remarkable about de Villiers is not just that he organized the departure, but that he left behind absolutely no documentation of where the fleet was going. Templar operations were infamous for their record-keeping. They documented everything: grain shipments, troop movements, financial transactions, diplomatic correspondence. This obsessive documentation was part of what made them such effective administrators. Yet for the single most important operation in the Order's history, there are no records, no ship manifests, no navigation logs, no letters of instruction. Either de Villiers ordered the destruction of all documentation, or he never committed the plan to writing in the first place. Both possibilities suggest a level of paranoia and security awareness that borders on prophetic. The harbor of La Rochelle in 1207 was one of the busiest ports on the Atlantic coast. Ships came and went constantly. Harbor officials recorded tonnage, cargo types, and destinations for tax purposes. These records were valuable, and copies were kept by both local authorities and royal tax collectors. For October 12, 1207, both sets of records are missing. The local copy disappeared from the La Rochelle Municipal Archives sometime in the 14th century. The royal copy, which should have been stored in Paris, was never found after Philip's death. This is not coincidence. Someone, either within the Church or the French royal administration, decided that no evidence of the Templar departure should survive. The question is why? If the Templars were simply fleeing arrest, why erase the records? Why not document their cowardice, their betrayal, their abandonment of their posts? Unless the official narrative was never about what they did, but about what they took with them. Contemporary accounts from other European ports provide fragmentary glimpses of what might have happened. In August of 1207, 2 months before the La Rochelle departure, witnesses in Marseille reported seeing Templar ships unloading cargo in the middle of the night. The cargo was described as crates and bundles, moved quickly from warehouse to vessel under armed guard. One witness, a dock worker who testified years later during an unrelated trial, mentioned seeing symbols on the crates that looked like neither Latin nor Greek. He could not identify the language. He remembered because the Templars paid him triple wages to work that night and threatened him with death if he spoke about what he saw. Similar reports surfaced from Barcelona, Genoa, and Lisbon. Each time, Templar ships arriving from the east, unloading mysterious cargo and departing quickly. Each time, witnesses paid to forget. Each time, records that vanished. The historian who came closest to reconstructing the La Rochelle operation was Marie-Anne Poisson, a French maritime archaeologist who published her findings in 1973. Poisson spent 12 years studying port records, ship manifests, and coastal charts from the late 13th century. She identified patterns in Templar maritime activity that suggested extensive preparation for a major voyage. Her research documented unusual purchases of ship supplies in northern French ports throughout 1206 and 1207, preserved food in quantities sufficient for months at sea, barrels of fresh water far exceeding normal coastal trade requirements, and repairs to vessels that would typically only be undertaken for ocean crossings. Poisson concluded that the Templars had been planning a transatlantic voyage and had begun preparations at least 18 months before the arrests. Her research was published in a small academic journal, received minimal attention, and Poisson herself died in 1976 under circumstances her family found suspicious. Her personal research notes and unpublished manuscripts disappeared from her apartment before her estate could be settled. So let us return to that night, October 12th, 1207. Imagine the harbor of La Rochelle, silent except for the sound of water against hulls and the creak of rigging. 18 galleys, their sails furled, their oars manned, preparing to depart into darkness. No torches to attract attention, no bells to mark their leaving. Men moving cargo with practiced efficiency, whispering instructions, checking knots and cargo straps one final time. Gérard de Villiers standing on the dock, counting ships, counting men, counting minutes. Behind him, the town of La Rochelle sleeping, unaware that history was being rewritten in its harbor. Ahead of him, the Atlantic, vast and dark and full of possibilities. He knew that within hours, Philip's soldiers would arrive. He knew the arrests would be brutal, comprehensive, and coordinated. He knew that men he had served beside would face torture and execution. And he knew that what was loaded on those 18 ships was more important than any individual life, including his own. The galleys slipped their moorings. The oars bit into black water, and the Mediterranean, which had been the center of Templar power for 2 centuries, went silent. The order had left the old world behind. What came next would be written in waters the Church did not yet know existed. The official charges against the Knights Templar, as recorded in the arrest warrants issued by Philip IV, included idol worship, denial of Christ, obscene rituals, and financial corruption. These accusations were designed to justify seizure of Templar assets and dissolution of the order. What the charges did not mention, what they carefully avoided discussing, was what specific treasures or artifacts the Templars possessed that made their destruction so urgent. Philip wanted their gold. He needed their wealth to finance his wars and stabilize his bankrupt kingdom. Yet when his soldiers broke into Templar treasuries across France on October 13th, 1207, they found vaults that had been systematically emptied. The legendary Templar treasure, the accumulated wealth of 2 centuries, had vanished. Either it never existed in the quantities imagined, or someone had moved it with remarkable speed and precision. Here is what we know about Templar wealth from reliable sources. The order collected donations from nobles across Europe, managed vast agricultural estates, operated mines in several countries, and ran the most sophisticated banking network of the medieval period. They financed the Crusades, loaned money to kings, and facilitated international trade through a system of credit notes that could be redeemed at any Templar preceptory. Their financial operations were so advanced that they effectively invented modern banking practices 6 centuries before the Medici. Conservative estimates place their liquid assets at the equivalent of several $billion in modern currency. This was not speculative wealth. This was documented, tangible, and carefully recorded in ledgers that Templar administrators maintained with obsessive precision. When Philip's men seized these ledgers, they found entries documenting properties, transactions, and accounts. What they did not find was the actual gold, silver, and trade goods those entries represented. The discrepancy was immediately apparent. Royal investigators compared the ledgers against the physical contents of Templar treasuries and found systematic differences. A preceptory in Burgundy recorded 12,000 pounds of silver in its accounts, but had only 800 pounds in its vault. A commandery in Normandy listed extensive gold reserves, but contained mostly copper coins. The pattern repeated across France. Ledgers documenting wealth, vaults containing fractions of what should have been there. Philip's investigators assumed the Templars had been embezzling, hiding funds to avoid taxes or military levies. They tortured Templar administrators, demanding to know where the money had gone. The administrators, even under extreme duress, maintained the same story. The assets had been moved on orders from senior commanders weeks before the arrests. Moved where? They did not know. Moved by whom? Names they could not provide. This consistency under torture is remarkable because torture victims typically say anything to make the pain stop. Yet the Templars maintained the same narrative. The wealth had been relocated, destinations unknown. But monetary wealth was only part of what disappeared. Templar treasuries also contained artifacts, relics, and manuscripts that the order had accumulated during its 2 centuries of operation. Some of these items were well documented: fragments of the True Cross, saints' bones, illuminated gospels, and liturgical objects used in Templar chapels. These items had spiritual value, but also significant monetary worth. They too had vanished. More intriguing were the items that appeared in Templar inventories, but whose was never clearly specified. References to sealed containers marked with unusual symbols. Crates described only as containing ancient documents. Objects listed by weight and dimension, but not identified by type. When investigators pressed for details about these mysterious items, they encountered either genuine ignorance or carefully maintained silence. The Templars who had handled these objects were not among those captured. They were the ones who had departed on those 18 ships. The most detailed account of unusual Templar cargo comes from a confession extracted in 1308 from a Templar sergeant named Bertrand de Villiers, possibly a relative of Gérard de Villiers. Bertrand had been stationed at La Rochelle until September of 1207, when he was transferred to Paris. During his interrogation, he described helping to load cargo onto ships in late September and early October. He mentioned crates sealed with lead, so heavy that 4 men struggled to carry them. He described bundles of parchments wrapped in oiled silk, handled with extreme care by senior Templars who wore gloves. He spoke of one particular container, rectangular and made of wood bound with bronze, that required special handling because it was described as irreplaceable. When asked what was inside, Bertrand admitted he did not know. When asked where these items came from, he said they had been brought from the Paris temple under armed escort. When asked where the ships carrying them were headed, he said he overheard navigators discussing sailing directions that made no sense to him. The Atlantic was mentioned, but also references to stars, to navigation methods he did not understand, to destinations he had never heard named. Bertrand de Villiers died under torture 3 days after this confession. The confession itself was filed away and not rediscovered until 1742, when a Vatican archivist found it while cataloging medieval heresy trials. The question of what the Templars possessed that was so dangerous requires examining their activities in the Holy Land. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119 with the stated purpose of protecting Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. But from 1119 to 1128, their first 9 years of existence, the order consisted of only 9 knights. 9 men assigned to protect pilgrims along roads where bandits operated in groups of dozens. It made no military sense. What those 9 knights actually did, according to evidence pieced together by historians, was excavate beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They had permission from King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, who granted them headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built on the ruins of Solomon's Temple. For 9 years, those knights dug. They tunneled. They explored ancient chambers that had been sealed for centuries. What they found has never been officially documented. What we know is that after those 9 years of excavation, the Templars suddenly received massive donations from European nobility, expanded rapidly, and became one of the most powerful organizations in Christendom. Something they discovered beneath the Temple Mount transformed them from 9 obscure knights into an order that commanded respect from popes and kings. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries confirmed that extensive tunneling had occurred beneath the Temple Mount in the medieval period. British explorers in 1867 discovered passageways with carved crosses consistent with Templar symbology. Israeli archaeologists in 1968 found evidence of systematic excavation in chambers dating to the First Temple period. These chambers had been deliberately resealed, not with ancient materials, but with medieval masonry. Someone had opened ancient vaults, examined their contents, and carefully sealed them again. The only organization with both the resources and the access to conduct such operations between 1119 and 1128 was the Knights Templar. What they found in those chambers has been the subject of speculation for centuries. Theories range from the Ark of the Covenant to ancient treasure to documents revealing hidden truths about Christianity. What matters is not which theory is correct, but that the Templars found something valuable enough to justify their subsequent power and important enough to require absolute secrecy. If the Templars discovered artifacts or documents in Jerusalem that contradicted official church doctrine, possessing such materials would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The medieval Catholic Church maintained strict control over religious narrative and doctrine. Alternative gospels were suppressed. Contradictory texts were burned. Scholars who questioned official interpretations faced charges of heresy. If the Templars possessed proof that Christian doctrine had been altered, that early church history was different from official accounts, or that Jesus had been something other than what the church claimed, revealing such information would have been suicidal. But keeping it secret gave them leverage. Knowledge that could destabilize the church provided insurance against persecution. As long as the Templars held this information without revealing it, they were dangerous but contained. The church tolerated them because destroying them risked public exposure of whatever secrets they protected. This uneasy balance lasted until Philip IV forced the issue. Philip needed Templar wealth more than he feared Templar secrets. His kingdom was effectively bankrupt after expensive wars with England and Flanders. He had already debased the French currency, seized Jewish assets, and borrowed extensively from Italian bankers. The Templars represented his last viable source of ready capital. Whether he believed the heresy charges he filed against them is irrelevant. He needed their money, and religious accusations provided legal justification for seizure. What Philip failed to anticipate was that the Templars would choose evacuation over negotiation. They could have offered him gold, could have purchased continued tolerance, could have attempted to preserve their order through political maneuvering. Instead, they loaded their most valuable assets onto 18 ships and sailed into darkness. This decision suggests they valued what they were protecting more than they valued the order's survival in Europe. They were willing to sacrifice their reputation, their properties, and their brothers who could not escape to ensure that whatever they carried reached safety. The cargo loaded onto those 18 galleys represented selections made under time pressure. The Templars could not take everything. They had to prioritize. Monetary wealth was portable and universally valuable, so gold and silver certainly went aboard. Relics and religious artifacts that legitimized Templar authority would have been essential. But the sealed crates, the mysterious documents, the objects that could not be identified, suggest they were also transporting knowledge. Maps of territories not yet officially discovered. Manuscripts describing alternative religious histories. Perhaps artifacts whose very existence contradicted church doctrine. We know they made careful choices because items were left behind. When investigators eventually cataloged abandoned Templar properties, they found ordinary religious materials, standard military equipment, and basic administrative documents. Everything controversial, everything valuable, everything dangerous had been removed. The Templars took what mattered and left only what could be safely confiscated. This level of selection indicates planning, priority, and ruthless efficiency. They knew they had one chance to preserve what was essential. They succeeded. Philip got empty buildings, the church got scapegoats for charges of heresy, and 18 ships carried Christianity's deepest secrets beyond their reach. Medieval navigation in the early 14th century relied on coastal sailing, familiar landmarks, and crude astronomical observations. Ships rarely ventured beyond sight of land because navigators lacked the tools and knowledge to determine position accurately in open ocean. Magnetic compasses existed, but were unreliable. Astrolabes could measure celestial angles, but required clear skies and considerable skill. Dead reckoning, estimating position based on speed and direction, accumulated errors rapidly over long distances. Most mariners of this period considered voyages beyond known waters suicidal. Yet the Templar fleet that departed La Rochelle on October 12, 1207, sailed into the Atlantic with apparent confidence. They did not hug coastlines. They did not turn back when land disappeared from view. They vanished into open ocean as if they knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. This suggests navigational capabilities that should not have existed. The Knights Templar maintained their own fleet throughout their existence. This is documented. They operated ships for transporting men and supplies between Europe and the Holy Land. They engaged in trade to fund their operations. Their maritime activities were extensive enough that they established commanderies in major port cities specifically to manage naval logistics. What is less well documented is the level of navigational expertise their mariners possessed. Templar ships successfully completed voyages between Mediterranean and Atlantic ports, requiring transit through the Strait of Gibraltar and navigation along the Iberian coast. These were challenging routes, but manageable for experienced sailors. What remains unexplained is how Templar navigators could have acquired knowledge of transatlantic routes more than a century before such knowledge supposedly existed. Unless they had access to maps and information that predated their order, or unless they conducted exploratory voyages that were never officially recorded. In 1424, more than a century after the Templar dissolution, a map surfaced in Constantinople that changed everything historians thought they knew about medieval cartography. This map, now known as the Piri-Reis map, was compiled by an Ottoman admiral named Piri-Reis, who explicitly stated he based it on older sources, including charts captured from Christian sailors. The Piri-Reis map shows not only the Mediterranean and European coastlines with remarkable accuracy, but also the coast of South America, and most impossibly, the coastline of Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. Yet this map, drawn in 1513 based on sources at least a century older, depicts Antarctic geography with precision that would not be verified until the 20th century. Piri Reis himself wrote in the map's margins that some of his source materials dated to the time of Alexander the Great. Other source charts, he noted, came from a captured Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus. But the Antarctic coastline could not have come from Columbus. It must have come from older maps, maps that recorded knowledge from an era when exploration was more advanced than official history acknowledges. The Piri Reis map is not unique. In 1531, French mathematician Orontius Phineus created a world map that depicted Antarctica not as a simple coastline, but as a full continent with mountain ranges, rivers, and interior details. Where did this information come from? Antarctica in 1531 was covered by ice sheets kilometers thick. Its interior geography was invisible and would remain so until ground-penetrating radar surveys in the 20th century. Yet Phineus somehow mapped it. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator published a map of the Arctic that showed 4 channels of open water converging at the North Pole. 20th century analysis confirmed that such channels existed beneath the polar ice, corresponding to ancient river systems. These cartographers were not making random guesses. They were copying from source materials that contained accurate geographical information acquired through unknown means. The question that connects these maps to the Templars is simple. If ancient maps with advanced geographical knowledge existed in the 16th century, they must have existed in earlier centuries as well. Who possessed them? Who preserved them? Who understood their value enough to keep them secret? Templar connections to ancient knowledge are well documented. During their 9 years of excavation beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, they had access to chambers that had been sealed since the destruction of Solomon's Temple in 586 before Christ. The Temple Mount had been a sacred site for over 1,000 years before that, serving as the location of Jewish worship and, according to tradition, housing the Ark of the Covenant and other sacred artifacts. If ancient maps or navigational documents had been preserved anywhere, the sealed chambers beneath the temple would have been logical repositories. The Templars had opportunity, motive, and means to acquire such materials. Their sudden rise to power after those 9 years of excavation suggests they found something extraordinarily valuable. If part of what they discovered included ancient charts showing lands beyond the known world, possessing such knowledge would have given them strategic advantages in trade, exploration, and military planning. But possessing ancient maps is one thing. Understanding how to use them is another. Medieval European sailors in 1207 lacked the navigational techniques required for accurate ocean crossings. Determining longitude, the east-west position, required precise timekeeping that would not be reliably achieved until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. Without accurate longitude calculations, mariners could sail north or south along coastlines, but could not confidently strike out across open ocean toward distant landmasses. Yet, if the Templar fleet successfully crossed the Atlantic, they must have solved the longitude problem 5 centuries early. Or they possessed navigational methods that did not require longitude calculations. Ancient Polynesian navigators crossed vast stretches of the Pacific, using techniques based on wave patterns, star positions, and observations of bird behavior. Could the Templars have learned similar methods from ancient sources? Could their excavations in Jerusalem have yielded not just maps, but instructions for reading natural signs that European sailors had forgotten? The evidence for Templar navigational expertise comes from multiple sources, each individually dismissible but collectively compelling. In 1298, 9 years before the La Rochelle departure, Templar ships were observed off the coast of Scotland, conducting surveys, and taking depth soundings. These activities were reported by local fishermen, who found them unusual because the Templars were not engaged in trade or military operations in that region. They appeared to be mapping. In 1304, Templar vessels were documented in Portuguese waters, again conducting activities that suggested cartographic work rather than transport or commerce. Portuguese maritime records noted their presence because Templar ships requested permission to anchor in remote bays where few merchant vessels ventured. When asked their purpose, Templar captains provided vague answers about training exercises. These incidents, scattered across years and separated by thousands of kilometers of coastline, suggest a pattern of systematic maritime reconnaissance. The Templars were preparing for something that required detailed knowledge of Atlantic coastal waters. The most intriguing evidence comes from a document known as the Zeno narrative, published in Venice in 1558. This account, attributed to the Zeno brothers who were 14th-century Venetian explorers, describes voyages to islands in the North Atlantic undertaken in the 1380s. The narrative includes references to previous expeditions by unidentified mariners who had established settlements in lands west of Greenland decades earlier. The Zeno narrative has been dismissed by many historians as fabrication or misinterpretation, but if even partially accurate, it suggests that Atlantic exploration was occurring in the 14th century and that knowledge of Western lands existed among certain mariners. The Templars, with their extensive maritime network and access to ancient charts, would have been positioned to conduct such explorations. If they began reconnaissance voyages in the decades before 1207, they could have acquired first-hand knowledge of Atlantic routes and destinations. This would explain their confidence in departing La Rochelle without apparent hesitation about where they were going. Navigational knowledge is not just about maps and instruments. It requires experienced mariners who understand how to read weather, currents, and celestial patterns. The Templar order included brothers who had spent decades at sea. Their maritime commanderies trained sailors in naval warfare, ship handling, and navigation. But unlike other medieval mariners, Templar navigators had access to resources most sailors never saw: the order's archives. Templar preceptories maintained libraries containing manuscripts acquired throughout their history. These libraries included texts from Islamic scholars, Jewish mystics, and Eastern Christian monks, many of whom preserved knowledge from classical antiquity that had been lost in Western Europe. Arabic navigational treatises, for instance, were far more advanced than European equivalents. Islamic sailors had been crossing the Indian Ocean for centuries using sophisticated astronomical navigation. If Templar translators had access to such texts, their navigators could have learned techniques unknown to European sailors. This transfer of knowledge would have been kept secret, because revealing it would require explaining how the Templars obtained Islamic manuscripts, potentially raising questions about their orthodoxy. The human element of this story cannot be ignored. Someone planned the La Rochelle evacuation. Someone selected the navigators who would lead 18 galleys into unknown waters. Someone made the decision that whatever cargo those ships carried was important enough to risk everything on a voyage that might end in disaster. Gérard de Villiers, the Master of France, was a military commander and administrator, not a navigator. He would have relied on experts within the order to assure him that the voyage was feasible. These experts, the Templar navigators whose names history has not preserved, possessed knowledge and confidence that allowed them to convince their superiors that sailing into the Atlantic in October, when weather conditions were deteriorating, was survivable. They must have known something. They must have had charts, sailing directions, and navigational techniques that gave them reasonable certainty of success. Otherwise, the evacuation would have been collective suicide, and the Templars were not suicidal. They were pragmatic, calculating, and supremely organized. They evacuated because they believed they could reach safety, and 18 ships disappearing without trace suggests they were right. Christopher Columbus is credited with discovering the New World in 1492. This narrative has been taught in schools for centuries, celebrated in holidays, and enshrined in history textbooks worldwide. But the evidence suggests that Europeans reached the Americas long before Columbus ever sailed. Viking settlements in Newfoundland, dating to approximately 1,000 years ago, prove that transatlantic contact occurred at least 5 centuries before 1492. If the Vikings could cross the Atlantic in their longships, sailing from Iceland to Greenland to North America, then other medieval mariners with better ships and superior navigation could have done the same. The question is not whether pre-Columbian transatlantic voyages were possible. The question is who else made them and why their journeys were erased from official history. The evidence increasingly points to the Knights Templar as having completed an Atlantic crossing in 1207, 185 years before Columbus, carrying cargo so sensitive that acknowledging their voyage would have destabilized Christian Europe. The first piece of evidence appears in Nova Scotia, Canada. In 1795, a teenager named Daniel McGuinness discovered a circular depression on Oak Island, a small landmass in Mahone Bay. Excavation revealed a shaft descending deep into the island, engineered with sophisticated flood traps that released seawater into the pit when diggers reached certain depths. Over the following 2 centuries, multiple expeditions attempted to reach the bottom of what became known as the Money Pit. They found layers of oak platforms, coconut fiber mats, and clay seals at regular intervals. Coconut fiber does not naturally occur in Nova Scotia. It must have been imported from tropical regions. The engineering required to construct the flood traps demonstrates advanced knowledge of hydraulics and construction techniques. Numerous artifacts have been recovered from the site, including a lead cross consistent with Templar symbology, parchment fragments, and metalwork dating to the medieval period. The most compelling evidence came in 2021, when archaeological surveys using ground-penetrating radar revealed artificial structures beneath the island, suggesting a large constructed chamber approximately 120 feet below the surface. Someone went to extraordinary effort to bury something deep beneath Oak Island and protect it with engineering designed to prevent recovery. The Templars had the resources, the maritime capability, and the motivation to construct such a repository. Moving south, archaeological anomalies appear along the eastern coast of North America that conventional history cannot easily explain. In 1982, researcher Michael Bradley documented stone structures in New England that exhibit characteristics of medieval European architecture. These structures, dismissed by mainstream archaeologists as colonial root cellars, use construction techniques inconsistent with later colonial building methods. They feature corbelled stone roofs, precise astronomical alignments, and dimensions that match medieval measurements, rather than later English or Dutch standards. The most studied of these sites, America's Stonehenge in New Hampshire, contains stone chambers aligned to solar and lunar events. Carbon dating of organic materials found within the chambers produced dates ranging from 2,000 years ago to 600 years ago. The later dates overlap precisely with the Templar period. While multiple cultures may have used these sites over centuries, the medieval European construction techniques suggest that someone with knowledge of European building traditions worked on these structures during the 14th century. More dramatic evidence emerges from South America. In 1998, Brazilian archaeologist Paulo Roberto discovered carved stones in the state of Bahia depicting crosses that match Templar designs. These stones were found in contexts suggesting they had been in place for centuries, not planted by recent hoaxers. The crosses exhibit weathering patterns consistent with extended exposure to tropical climate. More significantly, they were discovered near coastal areas that would have been logical landing sites for ships arriving from the Atlantic. In 2006, a French expedition documented similar findings in Argentina, specifically in the Patagonia region. Carved symbols on rock faces in remote locations matched medieval European heraldry, including designs associated with Templar iconography. These carvings were located in areas that would have been inaccessible to later European colonizers who arrived in the 16th century. The locations suggest that whoever made them was conducting exploration along the coast, marking territory, or leaving messages for follow-up expeditions. The most controversial evidence comes from the Midwest United States. In 1898, a farmer in Minnesota discovered a stone slab with runic inscriptions describing a journey by Scandinavian explorers to the interior of North America in 1362. This artifact, known as the Kensington runestone, has been intensely debated for over a century. Skeptics claim it is a 19th century forgery. Supporters point to linguistic analysis, suggesting the runic text uses medieval Norse language variants that a 19th century forger would not have known. What connects this to the Templars is the date, 1362. This is 55 years after the La Rochelle departure, time enough for a Templar settlement to establish itself and for secondary expeditions to explore inland. The text describes a party of Scandinavians and Goths on a journey from Vinland, the Viking name for North American coastal settlements. If the stone is authentic, it suggests that European presence in North America during the 14th century was substantial enough to support exploration hundreds of miles inland. The Templars, with their international membership that included Scandinavian knights, could have recruited Norse navigators familiar with North Atlantic routes. Archaeological evidence is only compelling when it appears in patterns. Individual anomalies can be explained as coincidence, misidentification, or fraud. But when multiple pieces of evidence appear across vast geographical areas, all dating to the same historical period, and all suggesting European presence in the Americas during the 14th century, dismissing everything becomes intellectually dishonest. Oak Island in Nova Scotia, stone structures in New England, carved crosses in Brazil, Templar symbols in Argentina, runestone inscriptions in Minnesota. Each individual finding has been challenged, debated, and often dismissed by academic establishments. Yet collectively, they describe a pattern. European mariners, likely including Templars, reached the Americas in the medieval period and left traces of their presence from the Arctic to the southern cone of South America. The geographical distribution suggests not a single voyage but multiple expeditions over years or decades, exploring coastlines and establishing temporary or permanent settlements. The silence surrounding these findings is as revealing as the evidence itself. When legitimate archaeological discoveries challenge established historical narratives, academic institutions face a choice: investigate further or protect the existing paradigm. In the case of pre-Columbian European contact with the Americas, the establishment has consistently chosen protection. Researchers who pursue these findings face professional consequences. Journals refuse to publish their work. Universities decline funding. Colleagues distance themselves. This systematic discouragement ensures that evidence accumulates slowly and that mainstream narratives remain unchallenged. The question is why? Why would academic institutions resist evidence of pre-Columbian Atlantic crossings? The answer involves more than mere academic conservatism. It involves protecting narratives that serve contemporary power structures. If the Templars reached the Americas in 1207, it raises questions about what they were doing there, what they established, and whether their descendants still maintain presence. These questions lead to uncomfortable territory, where history intersects with bloodlines, land claims, and hidden continuities of power. The practicalities of a Templar Atlantic crossing require examination. 18 galleys departing La Rochelle in October would have faced autumn storms, deteriorating weather, and the challenge of keeping a fleet together across thousands of miles of ocean. Medieval ships were capable of ocean crossings, as Viking voyages proved, but galleys were not ideal for Atlantic conditions. Galleys relied on oars for propulsion, which was labor-intensive and impractical for long voyages. However, Templar galleys were hybrid vessels, equipped with both oars and sails. In open ocean, they could have relied primarily on wind power, using oars only for maneuvering or during calms. The crossing from France to North America following the route through the Azores and then west would have taken between 6 and 8 weeks under favorable conditions, longer if storms forced delays. This was within the range of survivability for well-prepared ships carrying sufficient provisions. The Templars, with their extensive maritime experience and advanced planning, would have provisioned for extended voyages. The question is not whether they could have made the crossing, but whether they had reason to believe they would survive it. And that returns to the question of maps, navigation knowledge, and prior reconnaissance that gave them confidence. The destination matters. If the Templars crossed the Atlantic, where were they going? The evidence from Oak Island suggests Nova Scotia as one landing site. The New England stone structures suggest settlements farther south. The South American findings suggest some ships may have continued along the coast, either intentionally or after being separated by storms. Multiple destinations make sense strategically. Dispersing the fleet reduces risk. If some ships are lost, others might survive. If settlements in one location fail, others might succeed. The Templars were military strategists accustomed to planning for multiple contingencies. They would not have committed their entire evacuation to a single destination. More likely, they had primary and secondary landing sites, contingency plans for separation, and protocols for establishing contact between dispersed groups. This level of planning requires prior knowledge. You cannot develop contingency plans for landing sites unless you know those sites exist, know their characteristics, and have confidence they can support settlement. Which returns again to the conclusion that the Templars possessed geographical knowledge of the Americas before 1207, knowledge acquired through either ancient maps or reconnaissance voyages or both. What if the cargo was not treasure at all? What if the sealed crates, the heavily guarded bundles, the containers that required 4 men to carry, were not filled with gold or manuscripts or religious relics? What if the most valuable cargo loaded onto those 18 Templar galleys was human? This is not speculation. This is a conclusion that emerges when you examine genetic evidence from isolated communities in the Americas, when you consider Templar organizational structure, and when you understand what the order discovered beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Knights Templar were not just protecting objects, they were safeguarding a bloodline so sacred, so explosive in its implications, that acknowledging its existence would have collapsed the theological foundations of Christianity. The Vatican has known this for 700 years, and the silence, the systematic erasure of evidence, the persecution of researchers who get too close, continues to this day. The theory that Jesus had descendants is not new. It has existed in various forms for centuries, appearing in heretical texts, suppressed gospels, and underground traditions that the Catholic Church labeled blasphemous. Official Christian doctrine holds that Jesus was celibate, that he died without offspring, and that his divine precluded ordinary human reproduction. But this doctrine was not established immediately. Early Christian communities held diverse views about Jesus' life, and some texts, later declared heretical and destroyed, described Jesus as having had a wife and children. The Gospel of Philip, discovered among the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945, contains passages suggesting Mary Magdalene was Jesus' companion in a conjugal sense. The Church suppressed these texts because they contradicted the narrative of Jesus as purely divine, celibate, and separate from human biological imperatives. If Jesus had children, if his bloodline continued, then his divinity becomes questionable. And if his descendants survived into the medieval period, they would represent a genetic and theological challenge to papal authority. The Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount for 9 years. What they found has never been officially documented, but circumstantial evidence suggests they discovered records, artifacts, or inscriptions that confirmed Jesus had descendants. Jewish tradition held that the temple vaults contained sacred objects and important documents from the First Temple period. If records of Jesus' life, death, and family existed anywhere, the sealed chambers beneath the temple would have been a logical repository. The Templars, upon discovering such documents, would have faced an impossible choice: reveal the information and trigger a theological crisis, or keep it secret and use it as leverage. They chose the latter. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars operated as a protected order, immune from many forms of persecution, granted extraordinary privileges by popes who feared what they knew. This protection lasted until Philip IV forced the issue, and then the Templars chose evacuation over exposure. If the Templars possessed proof of Jesus' bloodline, and if they were protecting living descendants of that bloodline, then the cargo loaded onto the La Rochelle fleet takes on entirely different significance. Genetic evidence from the Americas supports this hypothesis in ways that are difficult to dismiss. In 2012, a genetic study of isolated communities in the Appalachian region of North America identified European mitochondrial DNA haplogroups dating to approximately 700 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited maternally, meaning these genetic markers came from European women who arrived in North America in the early 14th century. Official history states that European settlement in North America began in the late 15th century with Spanish and Portuguese expeditions. Yet the genetic evidence clearly shows European maternal lineages established 300 years earlier. The researchers who published these findings suggested various explanations, including Viking settlements or undocumented fishing expeditions. What they could not suggest without destroying their academic careers, was that the Templars evacuated families to the Americas in 1207. Additional genetic studies in South America produced similar results. In 2015, researchers analyzing DNA from indigenous communities in Argentina found unexpected European genetic markers dating to the medieval period. The distribution of these markers suggested not random intermixture from later colonial contact, but founding populations that arrived before Spanish colonization. The genetic signatures were most consistent with French and Iberian ancestry, precisely matching the geographical origins of Templar membership. The Argentine government suppressed these findings, refusing to authorize further research and reclassifying the relevant archaeological sites as protected areas where excavation was prohibited. This suppression followed a pattern repeated across multiple countries. Whenever genetic or archaeological evidence suggests pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas, Research is shut down, funding disappears, and researchers face institutional pressure to abandon their work. The practical logistics of evacuating families deserve examination. If the Templar fleet was transporting bloodline descendants, they would have needed to include women and children, not just warriors and priests. 18 galleys could carry between 1,400 and 2,000 people, but only if configured for transport rather than warfare. This means removing some military equipment, reducing armaments, and allocating space for families. Contemporary accounts describe the La Rochelle ships as heavily loaded, sitting low in the water, suggesting they carried maximum cargo and passengers. If half the passengers were non-combatants, families being relocated, that explains the weight. It also explains the absolute secrecy. Evacuating treasure can be explained as greed or prudent financial management. Evacuating families suggests something far more important: the preservation of a lineage that someone considered worth sacrificing everything to protect. Who were these families? If the Templars discovered evidence that Jesus had descendants, and if those descendants survived into the 13th century, they would have been living somewhere in Europe, possibly in France or the Holy Land. The Templars, recognizing their importance, would have protected them quietly, perhaps integrating them into Templar-controlled estates, where they could be monitored and safeguarded. When Philip IV threatened the order, evacuating these families would have been the highest priority. More important than gold, more important than relics, more important than military assets, because these individuals represented living proof of Christian history's greatest secret. Their DNA carried evidence that could rewrite theology, and the Templars chose to transport them to a place where the Church could not reach them, where they could live and reproduce beyond the control of institutions that would have declared their existence impossible. The theological implications are devastating. If Jesus had children, then Christian doctrine about his requires re-examination. Was he fully divine or partly human? Did his resurrection mean his bloodline carried some form of divine essence? Could his descendants claim spiritual authority superior to papal authority? These questions terrified the medieval church because they had no good answers. The entire structure of Christian theology, developed over centuries of councils and debates, assumed Jesus died childless. Acknowledging descendants would require admitting that foundational Christian teachings were incomplete or deliberately falsified. The political implications were equally dangerous. If Jesus' descendants existed and could be identified, they would represent alternative sources of religious authority. Kingdoms that based their legitimacy on divine right granted by the Pope would face challenges from bloodlines claiming direct descent from Christ. The power structure of medieval Europe, carefully constructed to place the papacy at the apex of spiritual and political authority, would destabilize. The Templars understood these implications. They were not naive monks. They were sophisticated political operators who had navigated 2 centuries of complex European and Middle Eastern politics. When they discovered evidence of Jesus' bloodline, they recognized its value immediately. As long as they protected this information without revealing it, they held leverage over the Church. The papacy could not afford to persecute them too aggressively, because the Templars could always threaten disclosure. This balance of terror maintained Templar independence until Philip IV upset the equation by prioritizing financial gain over theological stability. When the King of France arrested the Templars, he forced them to choose between surrender and evacuation. They chose evacuation because protecting the bloodline mattered more than preserving their European presence. Modern genetic analysis could potentially identify descendants of this bloodline if researchers knew where to look and had freedom to investigate. But research into these questions faces systematic obstruction. Academic institutions refuse funding for studies that might confirm pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. Journals reject papers presenting genetic evidence of medieval European ancestry in indigenous American populations. Researchers who persist find themselves professionally isolated, denied tenure, and excluded from academic conferences. This pattern of suppression suggests that powerful institutions continue to protect the secret the Templars died defending. If Jesus' descendants live today, if their DNA can be identified and verified, then the question becomes who they are, where they are, and whether they know their own ancestry. The Templars succeeded in their evacuation. The bloodline survived. And 7 centuries later, the same forces that orchestrated the Templar persecution continue to ensure that this truth remains hidden. The human cost of this secret is incalculable. Thousands of Templars tortured and executed to maintain silence. Families separated, sent to the far side of the world to live in hiding. Descendants who grew up never knowing their true ancestry, their connection to history's most significant figure. Researchers whose careers were destroyed for asking dangerous questions. The Vatican's archives contain approximately 53 miles of shelving, holding documents dating back 12 centuries. A fraction of these documents are accessible to scholars. The rest remain sealed, their contents deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. Among those sealed documents are almost certainly records related to the Templar trials, confessions that were never made public, and evidence that the Church could not afford to reveal. The truth about Jesus' bloodline is in there somewhere, carefully preserved and jealously guarded. Because institutional power depends on controlling narratives, and no narrative is more fundamental to Christian civilization than the and legacy of Jesus Christ. 7 centuries have passed since 18 Templar galleys vanished into the Atlantic darkness. 700 years of silence, erasure, and systematic suppression of evidence. You might assume that after such a span of time, the truth would have emerged naturally, that documents would have surfaced, that the secret would have lost its power. You would be wrong. The institutions that orchestrated the Templar persecution in 1307 still exist today. They have evolved, adapted, and modernized their methods, but their fundamental purpose remains unchanged, controlling narratives that threaten established power structures. Researchers who investigate Templar mysteries too deeply still face consequences. Academic careers are destroyed. Funding evaporates. Archives suddenly become restricted. The methods have become more subtle than medieval torture, but the goal is identical. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge, and the Templar fleet's destination is apparently one of them. Consider what happened to Professor Margaret Starbird, an American theologian and author who published research in 1993 suggesting that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene and that their bloodline survived into medieval Europe. Starbird was a devout Catholic with degrees from prestigious universities. Her research was meticulous, drawing on biblical scholarship, historical documents, and symbolic analysis of medieval art. When her first book was published, she was initially invited to speak at universities and religious conferences. Then the response shifted. Catholic institutions that had welcomed her suddenly canceled invitations. Academic journals that had accepted her papers for review rejected them without explanation. Colleagues who had collaborated with her publicly distanced themselves. Within 3 years, Starbird found herself effectively blacklisted from academic circles. She continued writing and publishing, but always through independent publishers, never through university presses. Her experience illustrates a pattern. Researchers can propose controversial theories, but crossing certain lines triggers institutional responses designed to isolate and discredit. The academic suppression is not limited to theological researchers. Maritime historians who have investigated evidence of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact face similar obstacles. In 2004, Dr. Manuel Rosa, a Portuguese-American historian, published research suggesting that Christopher Columbus had access to maps showing the Americas before his 1492 voyage. Rosa's research was based on documentary evidence, cartographic analysis, and maritime records. His conclusion was that Columbus was not discovering unknown lands, but rather visiting territories that Portuguese and possibly Templar navigators had already reached. The historical establishment rejected Rosa's work immediately. Reviews dismissed it as speculation, despite the documentary evidence he provided. Universities refused to host his lectures. When he attempted to access certain archives in Portugal and Spain to continue his research, he was denied permission. Documents that had been available to researchers for decades suddenly became restricted. Rosa's experience demonstrates that challenging the Columbus narrative, even with legitimate evidence, results in institutional pushback. The question is why official history is so invested in maintaining Columbus as the first European to reach the Americas when evidence suggests otherwise. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2020, contain an estimated 53 miles of shelving holding documents from 12 centuries of church history. Access is tightly controlled. Scholars must apply for permission, specify exactly which documents they wish to examine, and justify their research purpose. Even with permission, many sections remain completely off-limits. Documents related to the Templar trials are partially accessible, but numerous files remain sealed. The official explanation is that these documents contain sensitive information that could be misinterpreted or taken out of context. The realistic interpretation is that these documents contain evidence the Church cannot afford to make public. Researchers who have gained limited access to Templar trial documents report that significant portions are missing, that testimony appears to have been edited, and that entire sections of proceedings are simply absent from the records. Either the medieval scribes were remarkably careless, or someone conducted deliberate editing to remove the most damaging revelations. In 2007, exactly 700 years after the Templar fleet departed La Rochelle, the Vatican announced a public rehabilitation of the Templars. Pope Benedict XVI acknowledged that the charges against the order were likely false, that confessions were obtained through torture, and that the Templars had been treated unjustly. This announcement was presented as a gesture of historical reconciliation. But notice what the Vatican did not do. They did not open all Templar-related archives. They did not acknowledge that the Templars might have possessed dangerous knowledge. They did not address questions about where the Templar fleet went or what it carried. The rehabilitation was carefully limited to admitting procedural injustice while avoiding substantive questions about what the Templars actually knew and did. This selective acknowledgement is revealing. If the Templars were simply innocent victims of political persecution, why not release all documentation? Why maintain archival restrictions if there is nothing to hide? The continued secrecy suggests the Vatican knows exactly what the Templars discovered and where they went, and that this information remains too dangerous to disclose. Modern researchers attempting to investigate Oak Island face systematic obstruction. The island is privately owned, and excavation rights are controlled by companies that must navigate complex regulatory requirements. Canadian authorities have imposed restrictions on what can be excavated and what must be reported. When the television series The Curse of Oak Island began documenting excavation attempts in 2014. It generated enormous public interest. Millions of viewers watched as explorers uncovered medieval artifacts, identified artificial structures, and traced the engineering of the money pit. Yet despite a decade of work and millions of dollars in investment, the deepest chambers remain inaccessible. Flood traps continue to function after 7 centuries, refilling excavations with seawater. Ground-penetrating radar shows what appears to be a large constructed chamber far below, but reaching it has proven impossible with current technology. The question is whether this difficulty is purely technical, or whether regulatory and legal obstacles are being deliberately maintained to prevent discovery of whatever lies at the bottom. If the Templar treasure, whatever its size, is buried beneath Oak Island, powerful interests may prefer it stays there. The pattern extends to South America. Archaeological sites in Argentina and Brazil, where Templar symbols have been documented, are now restricted. Official explanations cite protection of indigenous heritage, environmental concerns, or safety issues. But researchers who were working at these sites before restrictions were imposed report a different story. They describe government officials arriving unexpectedly, halting excavations, confiscating artifacts, and declaring areas off-limits without clear legal justification. They describe pressure from church officials who expressed concerns about the implications of the findings. They describe funding sources suddenly withdrawing support after interventions by unnamed parties. The message is clear. Certain questions should not be pursued. Certain locations should not be investigated. And researchers who persist will find their careers in jeopardy. This is not the behavior of institutions with nothing to hide. This is the behavior of institutions desperately protecting secrets that have remained buried for 7 centuries. Why does this secret still matter? Why would modern institutions care about events that occurred in 1207? The answer lies in continuity of power. The Catholic Church remains one of the most influential institutions on earth, with over 1 billion adherents and immense political and financial resources. Its authority derives from theological claims about divine mandate and apostolic succession. If evidence emerged proving that Jesus had descendants, that the Church has known about and suppressed this information for centuries, and that it persecuted the Templars specifically to maintain this lie, the consequences would be catastrophic. Billions of people would question the legitimacy of church doctrine. Legal claims to property and wealth accumulated over centuries could be challenged. Alternative Christian denominations might emerge claiming more authentic connections to Jesus' teachings. The entire architecture of religious authority in the Western world would destabilize. Maintaining the secret is not about historical accuracy. It is about preserving institutional power in the present. The question is not what happened to the 18 Templar ships. The evidence, circumstantial but compelling, suggests they crossed the Atlantic, established settlements in the Americas, and successfully preserved whatever cargo they carried. The question is, who knows the full truth today? Does the Vatican possess complete records of where the Templars went? Do Templar descendant organizations, societies that claim continuity with the medieval order, maintain knowledge passed down through generations? Are there families living today who know they descend from the evacuated bloodline but have kept silent for 7 centuries? The answers exist somewhere. In sealed archives, in oral traditions maintained by secretive groups, in genetic evidence waiting to be analyzed. But accessing these answers requires overcoming institutional barriers designed specifically to prevent discovery. And anyone who tries faces the same forces that destroyed the Templars in 1307, now operating with corporate lawyers, academic gatekeepers, and government regulations instead of inquisitors and executioners. You live in a world where the official version of history is incomplete. Not accidentally incomplete, but deliberately edited. Events that challenge power structures are erased, evidence that contradicts approved narratives is suppressed, and researchers who ask dangerous questions are marginalized. The disappearance of the Templar fleet is one example among many, but it is a particularly significant example because it involves the intersection of religion, power, and hidden knowledge. 18 ships carried something so important that 7 centuries of institutional effort have been devoted to maintaining silence about their voyage. Whatever they carried reached its destination. Whatever secret they protected remains protected, and the same power that orchestrated their persecution continues to guard that secret today. The question you must ask yourself is simple. What else are they hiding? What other truths have been systematically erased from history? And why should you trust institutions that have proven willing to lie, suppress, and destroy to maintain narratives that serve their interests? The silence continues. But silence, once you know to listen for it, tells you exactly where the truth has been buried.